So please welcome Melissa Scanlan to the Next System Speaker Series here at George Mason University.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting me. This is a great opportunity to talk with all of you. I just was chatting with your professor before this and learning about the program that you all have at George Mason, which sounds really exciting and very unique in terms of being able to focus on such important topics. A lot of universities don't actually pursue this. So you guys are lucky to be at a place that does, and with Professor Mansky. So thanks for having me here. And I didn't know that about your inspiration to go to law school, or partial. I'm glad I had a partial influence on you. Thank you. So is everyone here who needs to be? Should we get rolling? Okay, great. I want to start by just recognizing that we are living through a very grim time in the world. And I'd like to invite you just for a few minutes to leave that and travel together to a near future, 2035, and travel with me to envision a time when we have cleaner air and quieter streets, when we're not using combustion engines, and we don't have fossil fuel emissions from utilities, where we have vibrant markets supporting organic local farmers and producers, leading to healthier people, where we have affordable, clean, and reliable water due to investments that we're making today and over the next decade in green infrastructure, where we have greater access to jobs and a more stable middle class set of neighborhoods due to a proliferation of worker-owned democratic enterprises, and where we have a more robust democratic political life that's fueled by workers' and consumers' participation in this democratic economy. So if you like that future more than our present, then I think you're in the right place, and we will have a good chat over the next hour or so. So this is the run of the show. I'm going to talk to you about the present challenge that we're in, sustainable business design. I'll highlight a few path breakers from the book and close with some short lessons for a livable planet. We'll start with, I want to shrink down my images over here so you guys aren't blocking my screen. Start with the present challenge. And I always love the wisdom of Homer to make light of something that is not light. So according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's many reports, and they have recently had 3 reports since August of 2021, we can see that major alterations in natural global systems are already well underway. This is not a future scenario with climate disruption. We have the highest CO2 levels in the past 800,000 years. And without major changes in human behaviors, the IPCC is telling us that our future will be bleak. Anthropogenic greenhouse gases have been responsible for a rise in temperature of 1.1 degrees Celsius since 1850. Now, I know that sounds like a very small amount of temperature increase, but it has really big implications. And we're already seeing the impacts of this. Sadly, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicates that really nothing can be done to stop climate disruption from intensifying over the next 20 years. Average surface temperatures are going to continue to rise. Professor Mansky mentioned it's 90 degrees where you are today in mid-April. And we're going to see a continual rising of temperatures. The sea is going to continue to rise. The question really is how much? And if we want to avoid extreme suffering across the world, the IPCC tells us we need to stop burning fossil fuels to reduce greenhouse gases to 0 as soon as possible. And that action in this decade is critical. So their report that came out in February of this year, 2022, documents food and water insecurity today due to climate change and an adverse impact on people's physical and mental health. It says if we fail to reduce greenhouse gases, we will face a situation where the rate of global warming outpaces humanity's ability to adapt. So consider that for a moment. A mass die-off of trees and coral has already begun around the world, and half the world's people are already highly vulnerable to serious impacts from the climate crisis. The international scientists call our attention to unsustainable development patterns that are increasing these kind of hazards. And in the summer of 2021 alone, we saw the impacts of climate disruption in multiple ways in both the United States and in Germany and in China. In the US, we had Hurricane Ida, the Dixie fires in California, the heat waves through the Pacific Northwest. So really extreme impacts already happening that we are dealing with, and we're not even at the point of passing the point of no return, but we're already seeing these serious impacts. So what can we do about it? What is sustainable development? All of the nations in the United Nations agreed unanimously to the Sustainable Development Goals. And these include addressing climate change, but go beyond to many social and economic goals. There are 17. These are international goals. Climate action, as you can see, is one of them, but they go much further and focus on things like poverty and hunger and well-being. And the United States is far from free of needing to address these broader social and economic disparities, as I know you guys have all been studying in your next system focus. So I want to draw your attention just briefly to a chart from Piketty's inequality research on the United States. This shows that we had a rather, from the mid 1940s to the mid 1970s, the top 10% of Americans owned a smaller share of total income at a fairly stable level. But since that period, inequality has accelerated. And by 2007, the richest 10% took half of all the income in this country. This kind of dovetails with some research that I talk about in the book by Kubishevsky's team that is looking at quality of life and showing that it stagnated after the 1980s in multiple countries around the world. That research was showing the average person in the US or the EU or other countries that they studied in 2019 was no better off than in 1979, despite huge growth in stock market and GDP. And that's because you can see from Piketty's research that shows the benefits of stock market growth disproportionately go to those who invest rather than those who rely on their labor to earn money. And not only is wealth disproportionate based on class, but it's unequal based on race and ethnicity. In 2016, for instance, the average white family in the US held 7 times more wealth than a Black family and 5 times more than a Hispanic family. So I'm highlighting this not only because of income inequality being a huge issue in and of itself, but it actually ties back to what I was talking about with greenhouse gases. The IPCC models show we cannot address the climate crisis without simultaneously addressing inequality. None of their models allow for it. So that brings us to look at the root cause of inequality and the climate crisis. And I will assert to you today and in my book that The root cause is the dominant business model, the investor-owned corporations that dominate and shape our global economy. They do really well what they're designed to do. Their top priority is producing financial returns for shareholders without any real commitment to larger goals. So that generates inequality, leading to greater wealth gaps, creating dysfunction, resulting in violence. And these systems reinforce discrimination and outcome disparities based on class, race, gender, and between high consuming countries in the global north versus the global south. So I invite you to rethink and to redesign business enterprises if we are going to have the ability to have a livable planet with greater shared prosperity. Now, I like to show this picture of New Delhi's India Gate War Memorial, contrasting April 2020 with October 2019. You'll remember that April 2020 is when we across the world really went into the first lockdown due to COVID-19. And while that was a horrible period in many ways, what it shows us is a glimpse, a vision for what can happen when we don't have combustion engines running. So while the climate emergency is frightening, there's so much space for opportunity to deeply decarbonize and reach the Sustainable Development Goals and immediately have improved air quality in places that currently are dominated by very dirty combustion engines. What if, instead of reducing suffering, which is the focus of the IPCC reports, we could design a better economy that allowed for shared prosperity? And a key to that is looking at business law. As Professor Mansky mentioned in the beginning, I'm a lawyer and I have been a law professor for the past decade. And what I found in my experience as both an environmental lawyer and a law professor is that environmental law is really good at surfacing and correcting excess pollution, but it's very poor at transforming the economic activity it regulates. And it really can't keep up. And the rising level of greenhouse gases is an excellent example of how the law is not good enough at curbing something like greenhouse gas emissions. And this is where I've come to see that business law is really essential for sustainability outcomes. Now, yes, investor-owned corporations should be highlighting environmental, social, and governance metrics and reporting on them, but I want you to be aware of its limits. The Global Reporting Initiative is the most widely used sustainability reporting platform in the world. Most of the major investor-owned corporations do some form of sustainability reporting, but the Global Reporting Initiative's own corporate leadership group analyzed this and produced a report in 2015 that showed some troubling results. They found that the reporting wasn't really resulting in sustainability outcomes. And that's because it wasn't getting at the root cause of the lack of sustainability, which is the business model. And I thought it was extremely revealing that they could say that the reporting that they were promoting really wasn't resulting in this, and they were calling for a change in business model. So what is that new business model? I think we should be aiming towards a democratic economy and building enterprises that support that. This would lead to a better quality of life than we have now, and not one that's just less tragic than it could be with a business as usual scenario. So that means a democratic economy would be one that's of, by, and for the people, where we'd have more owners based on democratic principles of giving one vote to each worker. And one where sustainability and deep decarbonization are designed as part of the core purpose of the business, where the businesses are designed to improve the communities in which they operate and share prosperity. So I want you to go back to imagining your city in a decade plus, 2035. And now let's talk about how to make this happen. We need to focus on the legal design of the business to get it to its DNA. But is this just a fantasy, or is it actually happening somewhere? We already have a business form that can facilitate that, and that is the cooperative business form. So what are these democratic enterprises? They are operating in most sectors of the economy in most countries of the world. They can be organized as for-profits or not-for-profits. And they're organized for a purpose based on ethics, values, and principles. The International Cooperative Alliance defines these principles and values globally, which is a really interesting aspect of cooperatives. Some examples of these shared principles and values are democratic governance, one person, one vote, cooperating with other cooperatives, concept of solidarity and fair trade with your trading partners, taking care of the community in which you are operating, and that includes concept of protecting the environment or sustainable development. So in this model, capital is subdued and it's flexible enough that it can apply to all different sectors of the economy and apply in different ways in different cultural settings around the world. So because cooperatives are a values-driven business model, and one where the shared principle of sustainable development or care for the community is core, they have a tremendous potential to fundamentally alter the sustainability of how we do business. I want to talk a bit about sustainability and purpose. This is the idea of building this triple bottom line of protecting the environment, society, and the financial health of the enterprise into the overarching purpose and influencing the day-to-day practices of a business. And if the purpose is to create sustainable value within planetary boundaries, then your day-to-day practices will be different. They will be focused on that. Currently, there are no laws in the EU or the US that require a social or environmental purpose. And so we're left with articulating a strong purpose in the legal design of each individual business and trying to set up structures within the government that would support the proliferation of these types of businesses. And lastly, it's very important that these businesses account for their triple bottom line purposes in a non-financial audit, so you can see what it is they're actually accomplishing. So we already have a different form of certification that's separate from the cooperative business form. This is a certification that any type of business, including investor-owned businesses, can get, and it's called B Corp certification. It's run by B Lab. Certifications are great, but they're not everything. This one is very popular, but they're not really equipped to closely monitor the numerous companies that they are certifying. And they actually have some lower standards than other certifications from other countries. Still, there is initial research from the Democracy Collaborative that shows the combination of being a B Corp certified and an employee-owned entity appears to produce the strongest positive results for stakeholders. And I have an example of this in my book with the Just Coffee case study, which is both a worker-owned cooperative and certified as a B Corp. So cooperatives, just like any other entity, really need a durable legal design to maximize the co-op values and principles. This really shouldn't be left up to chance or the whims of whoever happens to be active members in the entity in that one moment. Co-ops should articulate to members in society the cooperative difference And the co-op principle number 7, concern for the community, meaning that cooperatives work for sustainable development of their communities through policies approved by their members, can be integrated into their legal design. So improvement could start with grounding legal design in the co-op, shared international co-op values and principles, providing publications, trainings, and tools for members to set and achieve sustainability in their day-to-day operations. In the book, I give an example of Real Pickles bylaws and articles of incorporation. This is a co-op in Massachusetts, and they show how to effectively integrate the co-op values and principles into their mission and purpose statements and their governing documents. And they do this by providing clarity not only for the present current members, but future members. They give a durability to their sustainability focus by writing it very clearly into their legal documents. For instance, Real Pickles explicitly includes in their bylaws that they are to be democratically organized and support both ecological and human health in all of their operations. They also include a dissolution clause that removes any conflict between current members and those who might want to cash out from a successful venture. So they foresaw that they could potentially be very successful, and there would be an incentive for the current members to just take that financial gain out of the entity and dissolve the entity. And they removed that by thinking ahead and putting that into their governing documents. So no member can really cash out. And it allows for this entity to keep going into the future. So I want to just frame the opportunity that we have right now as we think about moving into this next decade, the decade that we are in, and the goals that we have to redesign and move off fossil fuels and meet the sustainable development goals. You already know that I think the best business structure to do this is a co-op. And we have the Biden administration now in the US that has set goals to move us off of fossil fuels and invest in infrastructure. They want to cut greenhouse gas emissions in the US in half compared to 2005. And there are a variety of methods that they're putting forward to do this, using tax credits to incentivize homeowners, streamlining local permitting to permit and build solar projects, rewarding utilities to add renewable energy to the grid, making a massive investment in the renewable energy sector and adding offshore wind turbines. The goal of having half of the all new cars sold being electric by 2030. Sound great? Although the bipartisan infrastructure funding that passed in 2021 will build a national network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, there are some major problems with the climate policies in this country. First, the ambitious climate legislation which is called Build Back Better, has effectively been blocked by unanimous Republican opposition, plus one Democratic Senator, Joe Manchin, who represents your neighbor in West Virginia, the coal producing state, and has strong financial backing from the fossil fuel industry. The other major problem, even if that agenda could get passed, is that nowhere is there a prominent discussion about the businesses best equipped to make this transition. This is an opportunity for co-ops to surface as the leading option for business design, and it's completely absent from the federal discussion about transitioning our economy. So I want to talk about the path forward and invite you to get active in this. As I'm saying, we need to rethink and redesign our relationship with natural resources in order to meet the IPCC's urgent message of swiftly decarbonizing to reach net zero greenhouse gases, and to design businesses so that they're oriented towards meeting the sustainable development goals. There's a fundamental driver of environmental outcomes that I am highlighting for you as the business model and the organizational purpose, and identifying an economic model like the circular economy to guide business is key to figuring out how to really orient businesses towards this transition, and then using a non-financial reporting metric to gauge progress on this transition and reduce the quantity of raw materials being used, greenhouse gases emitted, close wealth gaps. Those are all things that can come up in non-financial reporting. So the key economic sectors to deeply decarbonize require us to look strategically at the largest sectors of emissions and create an implementation plan. And globally and in the US, greenhouse gases to extract, process, and combust fossil fuels for energy make up 70% of the emissions. So this is the biggest area for change. That is why my book is called, uses a fossil-free economy, because this is the biggest area we need to change about our economy. I have chapters in the book on energy, food and agriculture, water, finance, and trade. And the book is really full of stories about path-breaking co-ops in all of those sectors. But I'm going to highlight just a couple stories for you today. And the top one being focusing on the energy transition. So bringing renewable electricity to the 1.1 billion people who lack any electricity and switching existing demand off of fossil fuels is the biggest challenge and opportunity we have at transforming our economy. Disrupting the energy business model would look like this. We would have a focus on energy efficiency and conservation. We would retire all fossil fuel electric generation plants that do not capture their greenhouse gases. We would develop renewable energy generating capacity in the least environmentally destructive ways available. Plan for greater electricity demands, incentivize switching to electric vehicles, invest in storage of renewable energy, and incorporate a diversity and abundance of customer-sited generation and storage, meaning home solar panels, business solar panels, etc. And we'd emphasize democratic ownership and participation models that reduce energy poverty. So all of this means jobs in the clean, fossil-free economy to make these transitions. And co-ops should be emphasized as the business model to move us into this renewables revolution. Why care about the business model as we disrupt business as usual and emissions? It's a huge opportunity for co-benefits of building democracy and meeting the sustainable development goals of bringing electricity to those who lack it and reduce economic inequality. And those co-benefits are much more likely with a purpose-driven cooperative business that has designed the triple bottom line of sustainability to guide its day-to-day operations. So let's just talk briefly about renewable energy versus coal. Global electricity generation is increasing and renewables are increasing. But overall, globally, generation has been dominated by coal, which is the dirtiest fuel we can be combusting. Positive side of things is that we've finally reached the point where solar is cheaper than coal in the United States. And the U.S. Energy Information Agency documented that in 2019, U.S. energy generated from renewables exceeded coal for the first time in 100 years. So we are at that turning point where the business case is extremely strong for solar energy and other renewables in the US. I want to step back for a second to talk about the history of electricity co-ops in the US, because I think it helps shape why I am making the argument in the book that co-ops are kind of a key to this transition. During the Great Depression, only 10% of rural America had electricity, and electric production was dominated by 7 holding companies that were privately owned. They had no interest, even with federal incentives, to electrify rural America. The New Deal changed that. It launched rural electric co-ops as locally controlled, mainly controlled by farmers, through a legislation and executive orders that promoted the formation of those co-ops and funded the formation of those co-ops. And today we see the results of that too. There's still 900 electric distribution co-ops across the US, 63 power supply co-ops. They're spread over 50% of our land base, and they're serving 1 in 8 Americans. The electric power that's being generated from these co-ops is currently extremely dirty. 40% of that electricity is coming from coal. But the opportunity is that most of those facilities were built in the late 70s and 80s, when there was a federal government push to build coal facilities, and they're near retirement. So as we retire these, and we can see that renewables are cheaper, this is a great opportunity to move the electric co-ops onto renewables. Renewables increased from 13% in 2009 to 17% in 2016 across all co-ops, but we really need policies to accelerate that pace. We could really do so much more with the right policies. However, one of the path breakers in the book that I highlight is one that's doing great things without any government policies. So I use this as a path breaker example because I think it gives people a sense of hope that even when you have political gridlock, you can actually make progress using co-ops, even in places that might be unexpected. So Cobb Electric Distribution Co-op was founded during the New Deal era. It is serving 200,000 members in Georgia around Atlanta. It's one of the top 10 largest electric co-ops in the US, top 3 for power reliability and low rates. And a decade ago, it worked with its state public service commission to get utility scale solar installed. So by 2019, it still had the most megawatts in solar of any US cooperative, and the largest percentage of solar on any of the Eastern cooperatives. Sometimes it's 40% of their demand being provided by solar. So this is happening in Georgia, in a state with no policies that particularly promote renewables or set goals of any way. And I think it stands out that they went in this direction, not only because of the business case, but because of their cooperative values. On their website, they emphasize the international cooperative principles and values and their nonprofit structure. They have their members participating and voting by attending an annual meeting. And they actually have a pretty high turnout for their annual meeting. In 2019, 3,200 members attended the annual meeting, and they had 10,000 at a larger party that they hosted at the county fairgrounds where they were having this annual meeting. So they're also engaging the community in that way and in democratically exercising their voice within the co-op. We could do so much more across the energy co-op sector with policy supports. And we need policies to promote renewable energy co-ops during this transition off of fossil fuels. But still, the business model, even without the policies, the business model of leading to co-benefits of democratic participation, lowest price for consumers, and investments in the local community stand out here with the path breaker that I've highlighted. So what can you do? Do you know where you get your energy? Does your utility advance the triple bottom line? Can you influence the business? Do they offer renewables? Can you opt out and self-supply with renewables? Can you participate with a group to work for better energy policies? Multiple things that you could be doing if you wanted to in this space. Next up, I want to talk about finance. Banks and finance play a critical role in determining whether we take the business as usual approach or the sustainable development approach. Banks determine access to capital with significant implications for growth and development of institutions like cooperatives or investor-owned corporations, and whether or not renewable energy or fossil fuels are being promoted by these business entities. The Rainforest Action Network documented that between 2016 and 2019, the top 10 investor-owned banks funded $1 trillion in fossil fuels in that 4-year period. So climate finance investment, which is investment devoted to mitigation and adaptation, needs to grow in this sector, and fossil fuel financing needs to end. Once you turn off the money spigot, the fossil fuels will no longer be as dominant as they are today. The pathbreaker I want to highlight for you is one called Caixa Popular. There are many co-op bank options that you have in the U.S. in the form of credit unions generally. But I'm going to tell you a bit about a pathbreaker from Spain to demonstrate how the co-op values and principles are put into practice in this bank. And you can use this to assess if your bank is aligned with your values and co-op values and principles. So this is a Spanish stakeholder bank that is owned by its employees and also by other cooperatives. It has values and principles-based purposes. It reduces waste. It operates on renewables. It's got no loans to fossil fuel companies. And I think the very interesting thing from the economic crisis of 2008 is that it didn't engage in any speculative lending practices that led up to that crisis. So it did not have any foreclosures after and in the midst of that crisis. It has a transparency in salaries and caps between the highest and lowest paid employees. And they use capital from individuals and cooperatives across various sectors and then offer special benefits to cooperative members, like they give higher interest rates on deposits, they support cooperative training, they offer an annual external audit, the non-financial audit that I mentioned. They help finance cooperatives to ensure that they thrive. And to demonstrate the impact of this on the system, I want to highlight for you the numbers of cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives in the Valencian community where this bank is located. So there are over 2,000 worker cooperatives in 2016. That's the statistic, the year of the statistic, over 2,000 worker-owned cooperatives and over 21,000 worker owners in that region. That is more worker owners in one region than in the entire United States. So bank cooperatives like this one with strong transparency and clarity as to their mission remove the tension between deciding whether to pay higher salaries or invest in environmental projects. And the salary caps are really important because they're such a contrast to what happens in investor-owned banks. So, and I write about that in the book. This is very countercultural to what happens in the investor-owned banks. So what can you do? You can ask whether your bank has strict salary policies with caps. Is your money in a cooperative bank? Is your bank investing more in renewables than in fossil fuels? Does it measure carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions? Is it reducing and reusing materials whenever possible? Is it conserving energy, empowering all of its operations on renewables? So those are questions you can ask as you think about where you put your money. The last sector I want to talk about briefly is international trade. We've been hearing a lot about supply chain disruptions and experiencing supply chain disruptions. And we hear very, very little about transportation-related greenhouse gases. The Paris Agreement, which allocated greenhouse gases to all the countries in the world, did nothing related to transportation greenhouse gases. So in the book, I call these phantom emissions because they're not attached to any country. If shipping were a country, in 2015, it would have been the 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. So this is something that has huge implications for meeting our climate goals. It also has huge implications for the greater sustainable development goals and whether or not we're engaging in fair trade and carrying out this concept of solidarity with our trading partners. So the pathbreaker that I emphasize in this area is coffee pathbreaker, Just Coffee. It's a worker-owned coffee roaster and distributor that's based in Madison, Wisconsin. And it started about a little over 20 years ago. They participate in a supply chain of cooperatives. And what I mean by that is they purchase the raw green coffee from producer-owned cooperatives in the parts of the world that can grow coffee. They participate in an importing cooperative that brings the coffee into the United States. And then they are a worker-owned cooperative that roasts and distributes the coffee. So at every point in the business chain, they're interacting with cooperatives. They use transparency and B Corp certification as strategies. They're putting all of their coffee contracts online. So when you buy one of these bags of coffee, it's got a little code on the back that you can scan in and you can see what the contract was with the grower of this coffee, the producer. And they're only using organic coffee that is fair trade and roasted based on renewable power in their roaster. So what got them to this level was their importing cooperative started using a carbon footprint tracking tool and distributing that to all the members of the cooperative who were importing. And Just Coffee used that to actually assess their biggest areas of emissions and figure out how to invest in business upgrades to reduce their carbon footprint. So I think it's a really interesting pathbreaker to highlight. If you're like me, coffee is a big part of your life and not something you can easily substitute. So figuring out how you can support a cooperative system like this was part of my purpose in focusing on this pathbreaker. So I think hope is a strategy. And if we encourage co-ops to flourish, we can mitigate climate disruption. We can create more owners. We can share wealth more equitably. And we really need to think collaboratively and internationally about how we get through this transition and come out on the other end in a way that is much stronger with greater shared prosperity than exists today. Some of the lessons that I took from the sustainability pathbreakers that I studied and wrote about in this book go to their legal design. So their articles of organization and bylaws generally include values and principles. They express a strong triple bottom line. They emphasize democratic governance. They often have hybrid membership options, meaning They might be worker owned and owned by consumers or another membership class. They have the strongest ones have salary policies and caps between the highest and lowest paid. And they often have funds set up to support education and charitable purposes. So these are just a few snapshots of the lessons from the book. I invite you to dig into the stories and hope that you can take lessons into your life and into your work, and leave knowing that cooperatives can be tools for prosperity. And they offer us an existing business form that we can operate within today, even without any legal changes to the bigger policies that are out there related to wealth and climate change at the federal, state, and local level. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hope to invite you to turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable doing that, and we can engage in a conversation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. So applaud quietly or loudly if you want to turn on. There we go. Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Scanlan. I tend to be informal in my in my approach. The students here have started calling me Dr. Ben oftentimes.
Great, Dr. Ben.
Yeah, which I kind of like. And I just have to say, I mean, that was an incredibly, unsurprisingly, but still well-organized presentation. It was so clear, steps, and extremely helpful. But I also want to draw attention to anybody who is watching this later on YouTube to the book as well, which I really strongly recommend as an incredibly valuable resource for looking at cases of examples, but also for getting into the legal design of the kind of what you call the cooperative ecosystem and the legal framework for that's necessary. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about future administrations, maybe not 10 years from now, but a few years from now, in which you might be Secretary of Commerce, if we should be so lucky. I think this will be very useful.
Yeah, big hope.
Yes, exactly. That's what's necessary, right? It's what's necessary at this moment. So really, thank you for all your work there. I see that Kristen has her hand up, so let's dive right into it, and let's see where we go.
Well, first of all, thank you. This is what I'm in pretty much day in, day out. So it's right up my alley. I have a couple questions for you and a couple points. So you really went in on the co-op point, and you highlighted B Corps, but there is a legal framework. There's benefit corporations. And I feel like that may have been, we hadn't talked about that, but it kind of does require transparency. It's a different, and environmental reporting. It is a different structure than co-ops. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that, because that does offer sort of a legal framework.
Yeah, it's a good point. Benefit corporation legislation started getting introduced, I think, in 2010, or passing in 2010, in the U.S. and in Delaware, Maryland, and Vermont were the first states. Delaware, of course, is the largest home to corporations in terms of incorporating there. So it's great that Delaware has that. And I do write about that in the book, Kristen. So there's a chapter where I talk about benefit corporations and the various certifications. I think it's a positive thing, but it's not necessarily going to result in as much of a sustainability purpose and flexibility as a cooperative. And I compare the legal design of them in the book. So I definitely encourage you to look at it. I am not against benefit corporations. I highlight some of the limitations and the lack of ability for stakeholders to actually have a voice in the benefit corporation. So they don't really have a legal ability to call for an accounting of the benefit corporation. And there isn't necessarily any kind of public accountability to those other than the shareholders of that benefit corporation. And so a lot of it is like the devil is in the details of any of these. And I want to say also that I don't think cooperatives are all amazing and meeting these aspirations. That's a really important point too. Like all of these are business entities that are run by humans who are deeply flawed. And unless we take care in how we build these business entities and the legal structures and how we steward them day to day, they can all be they can all fizzle. What I think is exciting about cooperatives is they allow for the most flexibility, the most opportunity to move beyond what's required by law. And I saw that in all of the Pathbreakers stories. Like they were all way out ahead of anything that was legally required of them. And the reason they were doing it was having this values-based grounding that motivated their thinking. That it wasn't just about compliance, but it was about creating a business environment that was actually a generator of like net positives, or positives across a lot of different metrics.
Okay, I have one more question if I can fit it in. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. It's sort of two-part. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on divestment versus engagement. You highlighted sort of this points about banks and asking your banks. Banks, I mean, I talked to Bank of America last week and they were saying they just won't divest. They're engaging fossil fuel providers and whatnot. And also the big question is you were asking them, ask about their carbon emissions. That's a big sort of unknown. I think Citi said, their CSO told me they've tried to do their scope 3 and they're about 50 to 60% sure that the numbers they have is correct, because we're looking at a large ecosystem and you're dependent on many other players for their data. So and I think banks have then taken this approach of we're going to just engage versus divest, because if we offshore these assets, right, if we get rid of them, if we divest, it just could put it in the hands of even worse, let's say, providers. What's your thoughts on sort of the divest versus engagement?
I mean, what do you think about the argument that if Citibank isn't funding Exxon, there's going to be a worse funder of Exxon?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think there's some really interesting case studies, especially in this exact moment, as there's sort of war raging in Ukraine and stuff that happened with last year in Myanmar. Basically, all these companies and funders of the local economy and banks have pulled out, and then they're basically now people that live there are reliant on even worse banks, right? So I don't think it's so black and white from my point of view and what I've heard from a lot of people say. And I do think that there is some merit to the engagement structure versus just divesting. I mean, you can't. I don't think that you can just exist. Right, we all have to do it together. So if you just try and exist as a small green bubble and say, and you're one of the largest banks in the world, like that doesn't seem possible to me.
So I think the example you gave was of a country, pulling out of an entire country, which is very different than a bank divesting from a fossil fuel industry. And I would see engagement as like a transition strategy, but we ultimately need to not have fossil fuel companies in business, or they need to have a different business model. So you see Shell making that transition, partly voluntarily, partly ordered by the court in the Urgenda opinion in the Netherlands. And you can see Shell investing in all different aspects of the renewable energy sector and transitioning its business model. Ultimately, I would like to see cooperatives and other businesses besides Shell and fossil fuel companies benefiting from the transition to renewables revolution. However, I think it's, like a not unexpected that we would have these companies that are well organized and positioned to come out as winners in the renewables revolution as well. And if a bank is investing in Shell's subsidiary that is building solar power in the US, Silicon Ranch, for instance, that's a different investment than if the bank is investing in drilling for oil somewhere.
Right. I mean, I don't think most people are funding new investments, right? But there was one point I was going to make right there, but I have now forgot it. So we can move on. But it actually, people are pulling out of countries. If a country is completely dependent, if their economy is fossil fuel, like that is people at the center, and that is part of the dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are opportunities for follow-up perhaps, and I also want to encourage folks to think about writing book reviews, which I'm sure would be welcome. And some of these conversations may continue beyond today.
Yeah, and I appreciate it's a provocative question, Kristen. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll have to write you. I'm in this space in and out. So I hear so many different arguments. I'm always trying to kind of I write. So yeah.
And it's good that you're hearing so many different arguments too, because it helps you more, be a sharper thinker in the space. I see Marissa and James. I don't know who was first there.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I just wanted to encourage as well that I put in the chat that maybe we could get 2 or 3 questions in a row, and then you could respond to them as a group if that works, Melissa, too. So yeah, Marissa.
Thank you, Professor Scanlan. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I was particularly wondering if, I know you talked about this a little bit, but if you could speak a bit more about the sort of biggest legal obstacles that some of these pathbreakers that you highlighted faced in forming their co-ops. I'm thinking here, I'm in Alabama and thinking about TVA, where we get our power from here, and how it's just such a different political landscape from when TVA was formed. And so I wonder, like in my own interest in potentially forming a co-op in the future, exactly what sort of battles do you think that folks will come up against?
So it's a great question. There's so many obstacles to choose from, but since you said about forming your own co-op, I'll focus on one. I explain in the book something that the city of Madison is doing to promote co-ops as a strategy for creating more business ownership opportunities amongst people of color and low-income people in Madison. And one of the biggest obstacles to forming those co-ops when working with people who are low income is that the banks are hesitant to give money because you're still having to demonstrate your individual wealth and ability to pay at that formation stage. So the initial members, many of them have maybe already had a bankruptcy, or they don't have the best financial records. Financial status, creditworthiness. And so the city, in trying to implement this, has had to come up with other ways to capitalize them, because going to a traditional bank doesn't work very well when you're working with an initial founding members who are truly low income and can't demonstrate the ability to put together that business. So I think that's a huge obstacle, and it's been really cool to see how the city has adapted to that reality and tried to figure out workarounds to still pursue that goal and not just give up on it. But it's really tough.
Excellent. I see James there as well.
Hi, first of all, I just want to say thank you for showing up today and giving this talk. It's been really awesome. But my main question was kind of about in terms of a fossil-free economy and a cooperative future, what's your vision in terms of growth or lack thereof, really? Because I know in the ecological economics space, there's a lot of different ideas about that, whether it's like green growth or degrowth or like a circular economy, which I know you mentioned in the book a bit. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about like what you think is the best model there in terms of having a livable and sustainable future, and like how we are to manage the economy at like a macroeconomic level.
Yeah, it's a great question. It sounds like perhaps you guys have been looking at the limits of GDP growth as a measurement of well-being, right? And I think that was the benefit of Kubashevsky's work, where their team was looking at genuine progress indicators versus GDP growth, and showing that divergence of the genuine progress indicators. Am I speaking in terms that you guys have already covered, or okay? So it sounds like you're well steeped in that. Now, I think it's really difficult to say that we should have no growth, because I personally am growth oriented. And what I mean by that is, there are certain things that you need to grow. Like, we need to grow renewable energy. We need to grow empowerment. We need to grow some people's wealth and shrink other people's wealth. So I think the no growth framing that dominates some of that discussion is problematic, because it's hard for most people to for it to resonate with most people. It also doesn't necessarily clearly communicate that we actually do need a lot of growth, but just in certain areas, and we need other areas to shrink. Like on the bank financing conversation, we need a lot of growth in financing renewable energy, and we need to shrink, degrow the investments in fossil fuel. So I guess I would encourage you to think about a framework that emphasizes growth in what we actually want, so that we are clearer about what we're saying. And you're already, it sounds like, critiquing GDP as a proxy for, and GDP growth as a proxy for what we need to be aiming for, a proxy for well-being.
All
Excellent.
right, thank you.
Yeah. Great. Follow-up questions on those already asked, or additional questions that somebody is sitting on? And knowing who is here, I'm guessing there are some additional questions as well.
Yeah, and I'm not looking at the chat, so I don't know if people are writing them. So if
I'm
you see
keeping
any there-
track, but we're
Okay.
we're good so far. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Are there additional questions that people have?
So I'd like to ask the group, are any of you members of co-ops? How, if just by like a raise of hands, if you're a member of a co-op, why don't you show us? Because I'm curious to know how common this is amongst this group. So only 4 people. So I think that's interesting too. And I hope that the talk encourages you to look at co-ops and see if there are ones that you want to join. When I think about the different entities I interact with, I'm a member of so many different co-ops, everything from food co-ops to investment co-ops. So they are out there, and you might need to do a little more digging, and maybe that's a follow-up conversation with Dr. Ben about the co-ops that are in your George Mason ecosystem. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you should know is that the Democratizing Nova project is sort of a multi-year project that's begun with constructing a database of democratization initiatives in the political economy of the region. So cooperatives and credit unions are one of 12 categories of initiatives that we're digging into. And James, who you were just talking with, is interning with DNOVA, and that's one of James's categories. So I'm curious, James, whether you're a new member of a co-op as a result of that work, or if that's a prior history. But this region is more cooperatives than most of us might have thought initially, but still relatively few compared to other parts of the Mid-Atlantic and even other parts of Virginia. And so one of the goals is to inspire startups and conversion, and for George Mason to aid in the conversion of the economy to a cooperative commonwealth, basically. So that's exactly why your book is so timely for the course and for the discussion.
Wow, great.
There's a lot of praise of your talk in the chat. I'm monitoring that, and then and there was sort of the comment that REI, unfortunately, is the co-op with a recognition of the limitations of REI as a cooperative. I think that's there. But that's what that comment was.
Well,
I had a question.
But I think it's you at least get the experience with REI that you're getting a dividend. So you're seeing that as a cooperative member, you get a share of the surplus, which would be called a profit in a different form of business. And so I think that's, that's fine that's great, actually, as an entry level co-op. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Some discussion going on in the chat about the relationship between cooperatives and unions and how to build that.
Yeah,
as well.
so there is a union co-op movement, and I actually spoke at their conference in maybe October or November. So if you're interested in that, you should definitely look into the union co-op movement. I think it's called One Worker, One Vote. Nothing surprising about the title of that. And a lot of people question whether or not unions are needed if you have a worker co-op. But when you have I think a lot of it has to do with scale of the co-op. So if you have a co-op that's relatively small, and like the Real Pickles example I gave, it's small enough for all of the members of the co-op to actually be involved in the board of directors. That's a very different scenario than one of the grocery store co-ops that I highlighted in the book. It has, many tens of thousands of members, and they have a very specialized board of directors, highly professionalized. So in that setting, a union's probably more helpful to negotiate with the management.
Yeah.
But a lot of it has to do with scale and ability to be involved in decisions, I think.
Absolutely. Excellent. I've seen some comments. Some people need to go to other meetings. You'll be hearing from Kristen as a follow-up.
Great.
Are there any last words anybody would like to share verbally here, or audibly, I should say? Okay, well, I'll just say thank you again for taking the time this morning. Thanks for all your work, and we'll be referring back to it in months and years to come as we're building programming here at Mason and through Next System Studies in general. And yeah, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, everyone. It's really a delight to be able to talk to a group that is so focused on this issue of system change. It's a rare opportunity, and thanks a lot for hosting me here at George Mason.
You bet.
All right.